A magnitude 7.1 earthquake hit off Japan's coast, and for the first time in history, the government activated a megathrust warning system it had built but never used. 3 days later, they raised fight plays out in committee rooms in Tokyo. Borehole instruments on the seafloor just recorded something no one had ever captured before. The fault creeping silently at 1 to 2 kilometers a day in 3 places at once toward the locked zone where 150 million people live. The probability is a fight. What the fault is doing right now is not. If the fact that a government just published 2 completely different probabilities for the same earthquake got you locked in, take a second and hit subscribe to Orbital View. We're tracking the Nankai Trough in real time. The slow slip data, the advisory levels, and the science underneath the headlines. Drop a comment. Do you live in a seismic zone, and do you actually know what your local government's probability number is built on? I read every one. A fault that is unzipping in slow motion right now. Caught on borehole instruments for the first time, migrating at 1 to 2 kilometers a day toward the locked zone where 150 million people live. The last 3 times this fault broke, it broke in pairs, and one of those times it uncorked Mount Fuji 49 days later. And the number the entire world is using to measure the danger just got contradicted by the institution that published it. Let's get into it. Part 1. The advisory that had never been issued before. On August 8, 2024, at 4:42 in the afternoon local time, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck beneath the Hyuga-Nada Sea off Miyazaki Prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu. Depth, 31 kilometers. Shaking intensity hit lower 6 on Japan's Shindo scale in the city of Nichinan, strong enough to knock people off their feet, strong enough to crack walls and throw unsecured objects across rooms. A small tsunami rolled ashore, 20 centimeters at Miyazaki Port, 10 centimeters at Kochi, across the strait on the island of Shikoku. The Sendai nuclear plant in Kagoshima Prefecture reported no irregularities, minor damage, no fatalities, and none of that is the story. The story is what happened in the hours after the shaking stopped. The Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, the institution that monitors every earthquake, every tremor, every volcanic murmur across the entire Japanese archipelago, convened an emergency expert panel. Not unusual after a magnitude 7. JMA does this routinely. What was unusual, what was completely without precedent in the history of the Japanese seismic monitoring system, was what they decided next. They activated a system that had been designed, legislated, debated in committee, revised, expanded, stress-tested, and mounted on the institutional wall for years. A system built specifically for this fault, this trough, this exact scenario, and they activated it for the first time. Not in a drill, not in a simulation. For real. Think of it as a fire alarm that had been wired into every wall of the building, inspected annually, batteries checked on schedule, connected to every speaker in every hallway. But the building had never actually been on fire. On August 8, 2024, that alarm sounded for the first time in its existence. The system is called the Nankai Trough Earthquake Extra Information Advisory. JMA issued it at the megathrust earthquake caution level, the lower of 2 alert tiers. The higher tier, megathrust earthquake warning, gets triggered only by a magnitude 8.0 or above directly on the plate boundary within the officially defined Nankai source region. The August quake was a 7.1 on the southwestern margin of the system. Not large enough, not centered enough for the top tier alarm, but close enough to the trough, deep enough in the subduction interface, and geologically aligned enough to cross the threshold that JMA's expert committees had drawn years earlier. The advisory ran for 1 week, and during that week, something happened across central and western Japan that tells you how much latent anxiety had been sitting in the population, just beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. Grocery stores in Shizuoka and Kochi sold out of emergency water and rations within hours of the announcement. Summer festivals were canceled up and down the Pacific coast. Businesses shuttered preemptively, not because of damage, but because of what the advisory implied. Hotels in designated evacuation zones saw mass cancellations. Some residents of coastal Shikoku left their homes and moved inland for the week. The system that was supposed to produce calm, informed preparedness produced, at least initially, something closer to controlled panic. And I keep coming back to the closing statement because I think it carries more weight than anything else JMA said that week. On August 15th, they let the advisory expire, but the final sentence read, "Please be aware that a large-scale earthquake could occur at any time along the Nankai Trough." The advisory ended. The hazard did not. JMA's own language drew the line explicitly. The institutional watch is over. The physical reality is unchanged, and the word any in at any time is doing exactly the work it sounds like it's doing. And here's the thing about the advisory system that most coverage missed. It has two tiers, and the lower tier, megathrust earthquake caution, is designed to be issued when there's a magnitude 6.8 or above in the broader Nankai source region. The threshold is intentionally low. It's a tripwire, not a verdict. The upper tier, megathrust earthquake warning, requires an actual magnitude 8 on the plate boundary itself. Nothing close to that happened in August. What happened was that the tripwire was crossed for the first time, and the nation's reaction told you everything about how much stored anxiety was already in the system. 5 months later, on January 13th, 2025, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck the same region. Depth 36 kilometers, again beneath the Huguenot Sea, again on the southwestern flank of the trough. Another small tsunami, 20 centimeters observed. Another round of advisories issued and lifted. Yusuke Yamashita at Kyoto University's Disaster Prevention Research Institute assessed it publicly. Roughly half the energy release of the August event, he said, and unlikely on its own to meaningfully influence the potential for a future Nankai megaquake. A measured, reassuring assessment from a credible source. And then, 3 days later, the number changed. The headline number, the one that drives policy, shapes infrastructure spending, and sits in the back of 150 million people's minds every time the ground shakes. And what that number is actually built on. The data, the model, and the institutional fight over both is where this investigation starts to become a different kind of story than the one most outlets told. Part 2. The 80% number and the fight underneath it. On January 16th, 2025, Japan's headquarters for Earthquake Research Promotion, HERP, the government body responsible for the country's official long-term seismic hazard assessments, raised the 30-year probability of a magnitude 8 to 9 Nankai Trough earthquake to around 80%. That number traveled around the world in hours. 80%, 4 and 5, within 30 years, for an earthquake that government projections say could kill up to 298,000 people. I want to walk you through what sits underneath that number, because what's underneath it matters more than the number itself. The probability has been climbing for over a decade, and the escalation is worth tracking. In 2013, HERP published its first formal assessment, 60 to 70%. In 2014, they nudged it to 70. In 2018, 70 to 80. And in January 2025, around 80. Each revision accompanied by a press conference, each one ratcheting higher. The committee chairman this time was Naoshi Hirata, professor emeritus at the University of Tokyo, and his public statement carried a particular construction that I think is worth paying close attention to. He said, "This probability is a number indicating that it would be no surprise if an earthquake were to happen at any time. So far, this looks like a straightforward story about a probability estimate going up. It is not. 8 months after the 80% headline, in September 2025, the same institution did something unprecedented. The Earthquake Research Committee, the body that operates under HERP and produces these assessments, published a second probability alongside the first. Not a revision, not a downgrade, not a correction. A second parallel number printed in the same document, sitting right next to the 80% on the same page, 20 to 50%. That second number was calculated using the Brownian passage time model. And here's the part that gives the institutional fight its real teeth. The BPT model is the standard statistical method that Japan applies to literally every other fault in the country. Every single one. The Japan Trench, the Sagami Trough beneath Tokyo Bay, the Itoigawa-Shizuoka tectonic line. Hundreds of active faults across the archipelago, all assessed using the same BPT framework. The Nankai Trough was the sole exception, the one fault where Japan used a different, older model to generate the headline number that shaped national policy. Until September 2025, when the committee finally ran both models side by side and published the results in the same document for the public to compare. The committee's own explanation, and the language here is institutional, measured, and devastating, attributed the change to unreliabilities in the past ground uplift data from Moroto Port in Kochi Prefecture and non-constant plate strain accumulation. Plain English, the data feeding the model is unreliable, and the core assumption of the model, that strain accumulates at a constant rate, may not hold. The 80% number flows from something called the time-predictable model, developed by Shimazaki and Nakata in 1980. The logic is intuitive and on its face, elegant. After an earthquake ruptures a fault, the ground near the fault rises, rebounding from the stress release. Measure how much it rose, and you can estimate how much strain was released. From that, work backward. If the plates keep pushing at the same rate, you can calculate when enough new strain will have accumulated to produce the next rupture. The problem is where the measurement comes from. The ground rise data feeding the Nankai model derives from a single source. Uplift records at Moroto Port, a small harbor on the southeastern tip of Shikoku, stretching back to the 1854 Ansei earthquake. Picture a thermometer hung from the side of a dock that's been slowly sinking into the seabed for 170 years. The thermometer gives you a reading. The reading came from an instrument. But the dock is moving. The harbor has been rebuilt multiple times. Different surveyors use different methods across a century and a half of wars, typhoons, and reconstructionized, and the error bars on those uplift measurements are enormous. And the entire 80% probability, the number that shapes evacuation planning, building codes, insurance markets, government budgets, and public psychology for a nation of 125 million people, flows through those measurements. Robert Geller sees this clearly, professor emeritus at the University of Tokyo, which makes him an institutional colleague of Harada, the HERP chairman. The disagreement isn't abstract. It's personal, and it lives inside the same university. During the August 2024 advisory, Geller told CNN the Nankai Trough earthquake is a made-up construct and a purely hypothetical scenario. He warned that issuing repeated low-probability alerts would make the authorities like the boy who cried wolf. His foundational position goes back decades, a 1997 paper in Science with Jackson, Kagan, and Malargia, 4 words in the title, "Earthquakes Cannot Be Predicted." Shinji Yoshioka at Kobe University was more measured, but aimed at the same structural problem. The 80% figure was likely too high, he said, because it draws from one specific theory. And then he added the sentence that prevents this from becoming a simple debunking story, the sentence that keeps the danger real even as the number wobbles. He has no doubt, he said, that a major earthquake will eventually occur along the Nankai Trough. So the probability is a fight, an institutional, methodological, deeply personal fight inside Japanese seismology. But the danger itself is not in dispute. And what neither the 80% number nor the 20% number can capture is what the instruments pressed against the fault are actually registering right now. Because what they're detecting isn't a probability, it's a physical process, something the fault is doing in real time that we've only recently developed the tools to see. Part 3, what slow slip actually looks like. Picture 2 surfaces pressed together under enormous force, your palms flat against each other, pushed down hard on a table. Imagine you're leaning your full weight on them. Now imagine that instead of snapping apart in a violent jolt, which is what a regular earthquake does, releasing everything in a few violent seconds, the bottom surface creeps, slides sideways, silently, so slowly that you cannot feel it happening. No vibration, no shaking, no sound. The only way you'd ever know it moved is if you measured the position of something nearby. A salt shaker 3 feet away that shifted half an inch over the course of 2 weeks. That is a slow slip event. And it is exactly what borehole instruments just recorded happening on the Nankai Trough, with a clarity no one had achieved before. A slow slip event releases the same kind of energy as an earthquake, sometimes an enormous amount of energy equivalent to a magnitude 6 or magnitude 7 quake, but spread across days, weeks, or even months instead of seconds. No seismometer on Earth can detect one directly because there are no seismic waves to detect. The ground doesn't shake, it shifts. The instruments that catch it are a completely different toolkit. Satellite positioning receivers, tracking ground movement to millimeter accuracy, tilt meters sensing when the Earth's surface changes angle by thousandths of a degree, strain meters embedded deep in boreholes, feeling the rock stretch and compress. And in the ocean, pressure gauges sitting on the seafloor, measuring tiny changes in the weight of the water column above them that signal the seabed has risen or fallen by centimeters. These events exist in a shadow world, invisible to the instruments we built to detect earthquakes, visible only to instruments we built to detect something quieter and stranger. We've only been able to see this world for about 25 years. And what scientists have found there has fundamentally rewritten the understanding of how faults behave between the earthquakes we can feel. Because slow slip events don't happen in isolation. They travel with companions. Deep, low-frequency tremor, a faint, continuous vibration emanating from the base of the fault's locked zone, pulses in sync with the creeping motion. Tiny earthquakes called very low-frequency events fire along the plate interface as the slip passes through. Scientists call the whole coupled phenomenon episodic tremor and slip. The fault doesn't just slip quietly, it hums, it vibrates, it produces a symphony of signals that are inaudible to conventional seismometers, but unmistakable to the specialized networks Japan has spent decades building. On June 26, 2025, a team at the University of Texas at Austin published a paper in Science that I think represents the single most important piece of new observational evidence in this entire investigation. The lead author was Josh Edgington. The senior author was Demian Saffer, a geophysicist who has spent years working on the interface between fluid dynamics and fault mechanics in subduction zones. They used 3 offshore borehole observatories, instruments drilled directly into the rock of the seafloor, through the sediment column and wired by fiber optic cable into Jamstack's cabled observatory network for real-time data transmission. These boreholes were installed years earlier through the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program. Think of them as stethoscopes pressed against the chest of the fault, not listening for the heartbeat you can already hear, the earthquakes that rattle seismometers around the world, but for the murmur underneath, the slow rhythmic pressure changes and subtle rock deformations that tell you the fault is alive and moving, even when the surface world is silent. And they heard it. 2 slow slip events captured in unprecedented detail, one in the fall of 2015, one in 2020. Each time, the slip started about 30 kilometers landward of the trench, that deep scar on the ocean floor, where the Philippine sea plate dives beneath Japan at a shallow angle, just 5 to 10 degrees off horizontal. From that starting point, the slip migrated seaward toward the trench at a speed of 1 to 2 kilometers per day. Each event took several weeks to cross roughly 30 kilometers. Both coincided with elevated fluid pressures deep inside the fault zone, water under tectonic stress being squeezed through the rock, lubricating the plate interface, enabling the slow creep. Edgington described what the instruments recorded as a ripple moving across the plate interface. But here is where the honest reading of this paper diverges from the alarming version. And I have to be straight with you because the honest version is the more interesting one. The team's own interpretation of what they measured was not that this shallow zone of the Nankai Fault is winding up toward a catastrophic rupture. Their interpretation was closer to the opposite. They described this section of the megathrust as one that does not contribute energy to these events, acting more like a shock absorber. In their reading, the shallow zone is bleeding off stress, releasing it in slow, controlled episodes, not storing it. So if the researchers themselves describe this as a safety valve, why am I spending time on it? Because the shock absorber interpretation is one reading of one part of the fault. And the evidence from the deeper zones, the locked segments, the section sitting between 15 and 30 plus kilometers beneath the surface, where the next catastrophic rupture would actually nucleate E, tells a different story. The shallow zone may be harmlessly releasing pressure. The deeper zones appear to be doing something else entirely, and 3 of those deeper processes are active right now, visible on instruments measured in millimeters that carry the weight of continents. Part 4. 3 active slow slip events. Right now, the instruments tracking the deeper slow slip are not the boreholes on the seafloor. They're on land, over 1,300 of them, distributed across every prefecture, every island, every corner of the Japanese archipelago. Japan's GeoNet system, operated by the Geospatial Information Authority of Japan, which sits under the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, is the largest land-based crustal deformation monitoring network on the planet. Each station is a permanent, continuously operating satellite receiver bolted to bedrock or a deep foundation locked onto GPS and other navigation satellite constellations, measuring its own 3-dimensional position around the clock. The precision after long-term averaging is extraordinary, roughly 2 millimeters of detectable displacement over a 2-year period. When the ground beneath a station moves, even a few millimeters, even over months or years, these stations see it. And as of January 2025, according to JMA and HERP's official monitoring reports, 3 separate stretches of the Nankai Trough are moving. The first is the area around the Atsumi Peninsula, straddling the border between western Shizuoka and eastern Aichi prefectures along the Pacific coast of central Honshu. This is not a remote stretch of coastline. Nagoya, Japan's 4th largest city, the heart of the country's automotive manufacturing corridor, sits less than 100 kilometers to the northwest. Crustal deformation, consistent with a long-term slow slip event, has been ongoing there since early 2022. Over 3 years and counting. Not accelerating dramatically, not stopping. Persisting. The second is central Shikoku, the island across the inland sea from Honshu, where a separate deformation signal appeared around the spring of 2019. That signal decayed somewhat through the fall of 2023, then fluctuated through 2024, weakening, strengthening, refusing to die cleanly. 7 years of intermittent activity. The third is the Southern Key Peninsula, the mountainous promontory that juts into the Pacific south of Osaka, where another long-term SSE has been active since early 2020, 6 years running. Osaka, population almost 9 million in the metro area, much of it built on soft sediment below sea level, is directly inland, 3 fingers pressing on 3 different spots of a locked door. No single finger is strong enough to force it open, but together they are rearranging where the stress concentrates on the frame, and the frame they are pressing against is a dam holding back 80 years of accumulated plate convergence. The Philippine Sea Plate grinds northwestward beneath Japan at 4 to 6.5 centimeters every single year. It doesn't stop. It doesn't pause. It has been pushing since 1946, the year of the last major Nankai rupture, 80 years of convergence. 3 to 5 meters of potential slip, stored in the locked zone of the megathrust, waiting. The scientist who opened the door to understanding these events is Kazushige Obara. In 2002, Obara discovered something nobody had noticed before. Deep, low-frequency tremor emanating from beneath the locked zone of the Nankai Trough. Not earthquakes in the traditional sense. A continuous, faint vibration rhythmically linked to episodes of slow slip. That discovery launched an entire subfield of seismology. In 2016, Obara and Itaro Kato published a landmark paper in Science titled Connecting Slow Earthquakes to Huge Earthquakes. Their argument was 3-pronged and carefully constructed. Slow slip events act as scaled-down analogs of the megathrust ruptures they might eventually trigger. The same fault, the same interface, the same physics, different speed. They function as stress meters, hair triggers sensitive to small changes in the tectonic loading state, lighting up when stress shifts. And most critically, they act as agents of stress transfer, physically pushing accumulated load from the parts of the fault that are slipping onto the adjacent parts that are locked. The phrase Obara and Kato used was measured, careful, and pointed. Slow earthquakes are increasing the probability of rupturing the fault areas. 3 years later, Masayuki Kano, working with Kato and Obara, published a follow-up that sharpened the finding further. They tracked how episodic tremor and slip, the coupled pattern of slow fault movement and deep vibration, behaves as it encounters the strongly locked core of the Nankai megathrust. Their finding, it silently invades the locked zone. Their conclusion, this process may intermittently increase the probability of large earthquakes. Hold those words. May intermittently increase. That is not a countdown clock reaching zero. It is not an alarm bell. What it describes is a loading mechanism. Observable, measurable, active in 3 locations along the Nankai Trough right now. The fault is not sitting still. It is being renegotiated, stress redistributed, locked patches probed, boundaries tested by forces that move too slowly for us to feel, but too persistently for the instruments to miss. And you can watch it happening. NUAED, Japan's National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience, makes this data publicly accessible. But there's a question hanging over all of this, and it's the question that separates justified vigilance from unfounded alarm. Has slow slip ever actually preceded a megathrust rupture? Not in a computer model, not in a laboratory simulation, on a real fault, in the real world, before a real earthquake that actually happened and actually killed people. And the answer is yes. The precedent is not ancient, it is from 2011, and the implications of what was found in the data afterward are the reason that every seismologist monitoring the Nankai Trough right now watches the slow slip readouts the way a cardiologist watches a heart rhythm that has started to change. Part 5, the Tohoku precedent, slow slip before the 9.0 March 11th, 2011, 2:46 in the afternoon, Japan Standard Time. Off the northeast coast of Honshu, the seafloor ruptured along a fault segment stretching roughly 500 kilometers. Magnitude 9.0. The Tohoku Oki earthquake, the largest in Japan's modern instrumental record, the 4th largest recorded anywhere on Earth since the year 1900. The tsunami arrived within 30 minutes. Waves topped 15 meters along broad stretches of the Sanriku coast. In some narrow inlets, the water climbed past 40 meters. Nearly 20,000 people died. Over 6,000 more were injured. 250,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. 3 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant lost cooling and melted down, triggering the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl and forcing the evacuation of 154,000 people from a zone that remains partially uninhabitable 15 years later. Economic damage exceeded $200 billion. The event was so far beyond every official planning scenario that a single Japanese word became its epitaph. Sotei gai, beyond assumption, unforeseeable, except it was not unforeseeable, not entirely, not when Taro Kato's team went back through the data. In 2012, Kato and his colleagues published a paper in Science, Propagation of Slow Slip, leading up to the 2011 MW 9.0 Tohoku Oki earthquake, that combed through years of seismic records from the Japan Trench with a precision that had not been attempted before. What they found was both elegant and deeply unsettling. Over 1,000 small repeating earthquakes, tiny quakes occurring at the same spots on the fault interface, over and over, like a key that keeps sticking, had been migrating toward the eventual main shock hypocenter in the weeks and months before the rupture. The pattern wasn't random. It had directionality. It had acceleration. 2 distinct slow slip events were documented in the same region in the lead-up, a magnitude 6.8 in November, 2008, 2.5 years before the main shock, and a magnitude 7.0 in February 2011, just weeks before everything broke. The fault had been signaling, quietly, over months, through exactly the kind of slow slip events that Obara and Kato would later describe as stress transfer agents. And nobody saw it coming. This is the tension I keep returning to, the one that lives at the absolute center of this investigation, and I think communicating it honestly is the most important thing this episode can do. Kato's team reconstructed the slow slip history retrospectively. After the fact, they traced the footprints after the animal had already torn through the forest. And the path was clear. The tracks were unmistakable in hindsight. But if you had been standing in that forest looking forward, watching the seismic data refresh on your screen day by day in February 2011, watching tiny earthquakes migrate northward, you would not have known what was coming. Because slow slip precedes some megathrust earthquakes, and it does not precede others. The 2010 magnitude 8.8 Mal earthquake in Chile was not preceded by a detectable slow slip sequence. Neither was the 2004 Sumatra 9.1. The precursory pattern is not universal, and as of today, there is no validated method, no algorithm, no threshold, no decision tree that can reliably tell you in real time whether a slow slip sequence is the prelude to catastrophe or just the fault doing what faults do. Even Naoshi Hirata knows this, the HERP chairman, the institutional voice for Nankai preparedness, the man who stood at the podium and announced the 80% probability. In May 2025, he said something publicly that I think deserves to be quoted exactly. There is a high possibility that a megaquake will suddenly occur without any precursors. Sit with that. The leading government voice for earthquake preparedness is acknowledging, plainly, that the big one could arrive with no warning. No escalating slow slip signal, no tremor spike, no advisory, no fire alarm, just the shaking. And for people in the coastal towns closest to the trough, towns where the first tsunami wave arrives in 2 minutes, that means the margin between normal life and catastrophe is the time it takes to tie your shoes. So what did Japan learn from Tohoku? 2 things that reshaped the entire Nankai planning framework from the ground up. First, the models had been wrong about the maximum. Dangerously wrong. Before 2011, the official planning scenario for the Nankai Trough capped out at magnitude 8.6. Derived from the largest historically documented Nankai rupture, the 1707 Hoei earthquake. After Tohoku showed that a fault presumed to max out around 8.5 could produce a 9.0, the Central Disaster Prevention Council went back to the Nankai models and raised the hypothetical maximum to 9.1. That jump of half a magnitude doesn't sound dramatic until you remember the seismic energy scale is logarithmic. The difference between 8.6 and 9.1 is roughly 5.5 times more energy released. Every planning document in the country, tsunami height projections, casualty estimates, evacuation zone boundaries, seawall design specifications, hospital surge plans, nuclear plant safety margins had to be torn up and rewritten from scratch, starting from a harder, larger, more terrifying number. And second, Japan learned that it could not afford blind spots on the fault. Not one. Not anywhere. If slow slip was going to give any advanced signal, even an ambiguous one, even one that could only be interpreted after the fact, the instruments had to be in place to record it, which is why, over the 13 years following Tohoku, Japan built the most ambitious, most comprehensive seafloor seismic monitoring network ever constructed by any nation in human history. Thousands of sensors, hundreds of kilometers of submarine fiber optic cable, multiple overlapping systems, DANET, DANET2, SNET, covering the seafloor from the Japan Trench in the northeast to the Nankai Trough in the southwest. And the final piece of that network, the western segment, the one remaining observational gap, covering the stretch of seafloor from Kochi Prefecture to the Hugonada Sea, where the August earthquake would later strike, came online in July 2024. 1 month. 1 month before the earthquake that triggered the advisory system for the first time in its history. The network's newest sensors, barely calibrated, recorded the very event they were built to detect. The last microphone was placed in the orchestra pit, and the first note it heard was the opening bar of exactly the piece the entire system was built to listen for. Part 6, the most instrumented fault on Earth. And this is where the investigation takes a turn that most coverage of the Nankai Trough completely misses. Because the story you've heard so far, the advisory, the probability fight, the slow slip, that's the story the news cycle told. What the news cycle didn't tell you is what Japan quietly built beneath the ocean in the years after Tohoku. And what that network is seeing right now changes the nature of the conversation. If you watch the episode this channel published on the Tohoku anniversary, the piece on Japan's post-2011 seismic rebuilding, you saw part of this infrastructure. Today, I'm going to take you deeper because the network that monitors the Nankai Trough is not just large. It is, without exaggeration, the most comprehensive real-time seismic monitoring system ever deployed on any single fault system by any nation in human history. And walking through what it actually consists of, instrument by instrument, cable by cable, matters for this investigation. Because what the network can see defines the hard boundary between what we actually know about this fault and what we are guessing. That boundary is more important for this story than any single probability number. Start on the seafloor. The first system is called DONET, the Dense Ocean Floor Network System for Earthquakes and Tsunamis. Originally built by JAMSTEC, Japan's Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, and now operated by NIED, the National Research Institute for Earth Science and Disaster Resilience. DONET consists of 20 permanent stations sitting on the ocean floor in the Kumano Forearc Basin off the eastern side of the Kii Peninsula, at depths ranging from 1,900 to 4,400 meters. That's 1 to nearly 3 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific. Each station is a self-contained observatory packed with instruments, Guralp CMG3T broadband seismometers for capturing the full range of earthquake waves, strong motion accelerometers for the violent ground shaking of a nearby rupture. Quartz pressure gauges so precise they can detect a change in the water column of less than a centimeter, which matters because when the seafloor rises or drops during a slow slip event or a tsunami-generating rupture, the water column above it changes weight, and the pressure gauge feels it. Differential pressure gauges, hydrophones, thermometers, every station connected back to shore by fiber optic cable carrying data in real time. When the seafloor shifts, when the water column flexes, when pressure changes signal that the seabed has risen or subsided even slightly, DONET sees it, and the data arrives on a researcher's screen within seconds. DONET 2 extended this coverage further southwest along the trough. But there was a gap. DONET and DONET 2 covered the central and eastern sections of the Nankai system, the segments off the Kii Peninsula and the Tonankai zone. The western side, the stretch from Kochi Prefecture down through the Hyuga-Nada Sea, the exact region where both the August 2024 and January 2025 earthquakes struck, had no seafloor network. It was the blind spot, the one section of the fault where slow slip, tremor, and pressure changes happening on the ocean floor would go unrecorded. That blind spot closed in July 2024 when the offshore subsystem of NNet, the Nankai Trough Seafloor Observation Network, went live. NNet is a massive infrastructure project, 36 seafloor stations, 1,600 kilometers of submarine fiber optic cable, that's roughly the distance from New York to Miami, connecting the coastal towns of Moroto in Kochi Prefecture and Kushima in Miyazaki Prefecture. Each station carries redundant triaxial accelerometers for measuring ground motion in 3 dimensions, velocity meters for tracking the speed of ground displacement, and pressure gauges for detecting seafloor elevation changes. The entire system is rated for ocean depths up to 5,000 meters and designed with deliberate redundancy. If a cable segment is severed by an earthquake, a submarine landslide, or even a fishing trawler, the data can route around the breakthrough alternative paths. When the August 2024 earthquake struck, NNet had been operational for roughly 4 weeks. The newest sensors in the entire Japanese monitoring network, barely calibrated, still in their initial performance assessment, recorded the very event they had been built to detect. and you can pull the data yourself. NIED makes it publicly accessible through their MOLIS data portal. On land, the backbone is GeoNet, the 1,300 plus satellite positioning stations I walked you through in Part 4. Layered on top of that, HyNet, roughly 800 high-sensitivity seismograph stations, installed in boreholes at 100 meters depth or more to escape surface noise. FNet, 73 broadband stations capturing the full frequency range. Since November 2017, all of these systems, DONET, NNet, GeoNet, HyNet, FNet, and the Japan Trench's SNet, operate under a single umbrella called MOLIS, monitoring of waves on land and seafloor. Over 2,000 permanent stations. On land, on the seafloor, in boreholes. What MOLIS represents is a nation's decision to never again be caught blind the way it was caught on March 11, 2011. And then there's the cutting edge, two breakthroughs that push the monitoring capability beyond where it was even 2 years ago. In September 2025, a Jamstack team led by Yuya Machida published a method in Geophysical Research Letters that solved a problem ocean engineers had been wrestling with for over a decade: sensor drift in seafloor pressure gauges. These instruments sit in crushing darkness on the deep ocean floor, 3,000–4,000 meters down, and over months and years, their readings slowly wander. They drift out of calibration in ways that look, in the data, exactly like the tiny gradual pressure changes that would signal slow slip. Noise masquerading as signal. Machida's team developed a correction algorithm that strips out the drift, isolates the real tectonic signal, and what it enables is genuinely new: near real-time detection of slow slip events from seafloor instruments. Before this correction, researchers had to wait months or years, accumulating enough data to see through the noise by statistical averaging. Now the seafloor network can watch slow slip evolve on timescales of weeks to months. Separately, Yusuke Yokota at the University of Tokyo has been pioneering GNSS acoustic positioning, combining satellite navigation signals with acoustic pulses bounced off transponders bolted to the seabed to measure horizontal seafloor displacement directly in the deep ocean far from any land-based GPS station. This technique detected offshore slow slip events in the Bungo Channel between Shikoku and Kyushu, and off the Kii Peninsula, areas where land-based GeoNet stations are too far from the action to see what the fault's outermost edge is doing. It's the offshore equivalent of GeoNet, and it closes the last geometrical gap in the monitoring architecture. So I want to hold two things at once here, because they're both true and they point in different directions. In one hand, if slow slip accelerates, if tremor patterns shift, if the fault begins doing something anomalous, Japan will see it. The instruments are in place. The data is flowing. The coverage is, for the first time, complete. No other fault on Earth is watched this closely. In the other hand, seeing the fault and predicting when it breaks are categorically different operations. The most elaborate stethoscope ever pressed against a patient's chest can record every heartbeat, catalog every murmur, timestamp every flutter, but it cannot tell you when the heart will stop. It tells you what the heart is doing right now. And right now, the Nankai megathrust has a heartbeat that history can help you interpret, because this fault has a pattern of behavior that separates it from nearly every other subduction zone on the planet. This fault breaks in pairs. Part 7, the fault that breaks in pairs. The Nankai Trough is not one fault. It is a segmented system, a series of interlocking sections that can rupture individually, in rapid sequence, or on one known occasion, all at once. Understanding the segmentation is critical because the segments are what make the difference between a catastrophic earthquake and a civilization-altering one. The official framework divides the megathrust into 5 segments, labeled A through E, grouped into 3 zones running from southwest to northeast. The Nankai zone covers segments A and B on the western side, roughly offshore of Shikoku and the western Kii Peninsula. The Tonankai zone covers segments C and D in the center, and the Tokai zone on the eastern end incorporates the overlap of C, D, and E, extending northeast toward Suruga Bay and the approaches of the greater Tokyo metropolitan area. Beneath all of them, the Philippine Sea plate slides northwestward at that relentless 4 to 6.5 centimeters per year, diving under Japan at a shallow angle, about 5 degrees near the trench, steepening to roughly 10 degrees beneath Honshu. A secondary structure called the megasplay fault branches off the main plate interface at a steeper angle of approximately 25 degrees. The splay matters because it is believed to be the structure that generates the largest, most devastating tsunamis, damoine. When it ruptures, it thrusts a wedge of rock upward into the water column like a paddle shoved beneath the surface of a bathtub. Now, the pattern. This is the part of the investigation I need you to lock onto, because this behavioral signature is what transforms the Nankai Trough from another dangerous subduction zone into something qualitatively different. On all but one known historical occasion, when the eastern segments of the Nankai Trough ruptured, the western segments followed, sometimes within hours, sometimes within days, sometimes the gap stretched to years. But the pattern repeats across a millennium of documented Japanese seismicity with a consistency that is frankly unusual for any fault system anywhere on Earth. And the clearest demonstration, the case study that should stay in your mind for the rest of this investigation, is 1854. December 23rd, 1854. The Ensei Tokai earthquake. The eastern segments of the Nankai system ruptured. Estimated magnitude 8.4, possibly as high as 8.7 depending on the reconstruction method. Violent shaking across the Tokai region. Tsunami along the Pacific coast. Buildings collapsed. The Tokai segment, which had last ruptured in 1707 hours, 147 years of accumulated strain, broke open. And then, 32 hours later, on December 24th, the Ansei Nankai earthquake. The western segments ruptured, also estimated at magnitude 8.4. A second tsunami, more destruction, concentrated this time on the coasts of Shikoku and the western Kii Peninsula. The Ansei Nankai event destroyed more than 30,000 buildings. Combined casualties across both events reached at least several thousand. 32 hours between a magnitude 8.4 and another magnitude 8.4. 2 megathrust earthquakes from adjacent segments of the same fault, separated by the time it takes to fly from Tokyo to Los Angeles. And here is the detail from the historical record that I have not been able to set down since I first read it. In Osaka, after the first earthquake, residents evacuated onto boats in the harbor. Osaka in 1854 was a commercial hub, Japan's kitchen, they called it, with a dense network of canals and harbor berths. The reasoning was sound. Get off the unstable ground. Get away from collapsing wooden structures. Move to the water where the shaking can't topple a building onto you. Thousands of people crowded onto boats in the harbor channels. They survived the first earthquake. They survived the first day's tsunami, which was relatively small in the protected waters of Osaka Bay. And then, 32 hours later, the second earthquake ruptured a different segment, generated a different tsunami from a different angle, and the water surged through the harbor approaches, rose through the canal system, and crushed the boats. People who had made the rational decision, who had evacuated to the safest place they could identify based on the threat they understood, were killed by the threat that hadn't arrived yet, the one they had no framework to anticipate. That is what sequential rupture means in human terms. The first earthquake isn't the event. It is the opening act. And the intermission can be 32 hours, or it can be 2 years. Because the 1944 Tonankai and 1946 Nankai ruptures repeated the same pattern with a longer gap. December 7th, 1944, the same date as Pearl Harbor. 3 years later, the central segments broke, magnitude 7.9 to 8.1. Heaviest damage in the Nagoya Industrial District, aircraft factories, munitions plants, the infrastructure of Japan's wartime economy, over 1,200 dead. But Japan was at war, and military censorship suppressed the reporting. The true death toll remains uncertain to this day. 2 years later, December 21st, 1946, the western segments ruptured, magnitude 8.0 to 8.3. And here is a detail about this pair that matters for the probability models. Both events were somewhat smaller than the 1707 and 1854 predecessors. Under-instrumented, under-documented, recorded through the distortions of wartime censorship and post-war chaos, which means the two most recent data points in the historical record, the events the probability models weight most heavily because they're closest in time, may understate the true maximum. The calibration data itself carries an error, and the error runs in one direction, which brings me to the Tokai Gap, the easternmost major segment of the Nankai system, the section whose rupture would send shaking and tsunami toward the Suruga Bay coast, toward Shizuoka Prefecture, toward the southwestern approaches of the Tokyo-Yokohama metropolitan complex, where roughly 38 million people live, has not ruptured since 1854. 172 years of unbroken plate convergence, 4 to 6.5 centimeters per year, every single year compounding. That's somewhere between 7 and 11 meters of accumulated potential slip, stored as elastic strain in the locked portion of the fault, bending the overlying crust like a bow being drawn slowly, invisibly, continuously. Every other major segment of the Nankai system has released at least some of its accumulated strain in the intervening 1854, 1944, and 1946 events. The Tokai segment participated in none of them. A locked door pushed from the other side for 172 years. And the cities on this side of the door, Shizuoka, Hamamatsu, the Hamaoka nuclear plant, the western margins of Greater Tokyo, were built during the silence. But the 1854 pair, devastating as it was, as indelible as the Osaka harbor image remains, is not the worst case in the historical record, because there is one event, one single rupture in over 1,000 years of Japanese documentation, where every segment broke at the same time, and what followed 49 days later was something the earthquake itself did not cause. Part 8, 1707 Jiu, when everything broke at once. October 28, 1707. The Hoi earthquake. Estimated magnitude 8.6 to 8.7. At the time, the largest earthquake in Japanese recorded history, a record that would stand for over 300 years until Tohoku exceeded it in 2011. Every segment of the Nankai Trough ruptured. Simultaneously, the entire 900-kilometer length of the megathrust Gising from the Hyuga-Nada Sea in the southwest, up past Shikoku, along the Kii Peninsula, through the Tonankai Zone, and into Suruga Bay in the northeast, tore open in a single catastrophic event. Not a sequential pair with hours or years between acts. Not a partial rupture of one zone, triggering a delayed response in another. Everything, all at once. In a matter of minutes, the full length of the subduction interface released centuries of accumulated strain in a single convulsion. Tsunami waves reached approximately 10 meters along the Pacific coast of Shikoku and the Kii Peninsula. More than 5,000 people died in a Japan whose total population was roughly 30 million, whose buildings were almost entirely wood and thatch, whose coastal settlements had no engineered defenses, no concrete seawalls, no J-alert system broadcasting warnings to mobile phones. But the Hoi earthquake was Act 1, and the audience had no idea there was a second act coming, because the second act came from a completely different direction. 49 days later, December 16th, 1707, Mount Fuji erupted, the Hoi eruption, VEI5 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the same intensity category as Mount St. Helens in 1980, roughly 800 million cubic meters of tephra, volcanic ash, pumice, fragmented rock, blasted into the atmosphere over a sustained eruption lasting 16 days. The eruption opened a new crater on Fuji's southeastern flank, the Hoi crater, a scar 300 meters across and 200 meters deep, still visible today to anyone riding the Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka. The ash plume traveled east on the prevailing winter winds and fell on Edo, the city that would become modern Tokyo, roughly 100 kilometers to the northeast. Accounts from the period describe ash accumulating to a depth of several centimeters in the streets. Fields were buried, Roofs collapsed under the weight. Water supplies, open wells, rainwater cisterns were contaminated. Rivers carried the ash downstream, raising riverbeds and triggering floods in the Sakawa River system that persisted for decades. The eruption didn't just damage Edo, it altered the hydrology of the surrounding region for a generation. And here's the physical connection, because this is where the compound threat stops being coincidence and becomes mechanism. And I need you to see the mechanism clearly. In 2012, Chesley and colleagues published a study in Geophysical Research Letters that modeled the stress interaction between the Hoi earthquake and the volcanic plumbing system beneath Mount Fuji. What they calculated was precise, and once you understand it, viscerally clear. The earthquake didn't create the magma. Magma had been accumulating beneath Fuji for centuries, building pressure in a deep reservoir connected to the surface by a network of dikes, thin, vertical pathways through fractured rock, held shut by the immense weight of the crust above them. What the earthquake did was change the stress field surrounding one of those dikes at depth. Specifically, it decreased the normal stress, the clamping force squeezing the dike closed, by 1.06 bars at a depth of 20 kilometers beneath the volcano. 1.06 bars, roughly 1 atmosphere of pressure, the equivalent of removing a 1-meter column of water from on top of the rock. In any other context, that change would be negligible. The lithostatic pressure at 20 kilometers depth is roughly 5,400 bars. 1.06 bars is nothing. A rounding error. But in a volcanic system already teetering at the threshold of failure, magma pressure nearly balanced against the confining stress of the rock. That tiny reduction in clamping force tipped the scales. Picture a pressure cooker that has been building toward its limit for centuries. The earthquake didn't turn up the heat. It jiggled the valve. And 49 days of internal pressure readjustment later, fluid migration, dike propagation, stress redistribution through the conduit system, arcs. The valve blew. I want to be careful here, because being careful is what separates credible investigation from fear content, and this channel only does one of those. The Hoi sequence is a precedent. It is not a prediction. Nobody is predicting that the next Nankai rupture will trigger a Fuji eruption. The current state of Fuji's magmatic system is monitored by JMA's Volcano Observation Network, and as of the most recent reports, the volcano does not show signs of elevated unrest. Whether a future megathrust earthquake would produce a comparable stress change on Fuji's plumbing depends on variables: rupture geometry, propagational direction, the current pressure state of the magma reservoir that nobody can forecast with the precision needed to make that call. But the physical pathway exists. It is documented in the peer-reviewed literature. It operated once, producing a compound catastrophe, earthquake, tsunami, volcanic eruption, race within 50 days. And that combination sits in no single hazard planning document. Japan plans for earthquakes. Japan plans for tsunamis. Japan plans for volcanic eruptions. No operational framework integrates all three occurring in sequence from a shared triggering mechanism, because integrating them would require acknowledging a scenario so severe that the planning resources to address it may not exist. Consider what a modern Hoi-scale eruption would mean for Tokyo, a metropolitan area of nearly 14 million people, with Greater Tokyo holding close to 38 million. Even a modest ash fall of 5 to 10 centimeters would ground all air traffic at Haneda and Narita airports indefinitely. Rail networks would shut down. Volcanic ash is abrasive and electrically conductive, destroying the pantograph connections that power Japan's trains. Stormwater drainage systems would clog. The open-air water treatment facilities serving millions would be contaminated. Road surfaces would become impassable as wet ash turns to a slurry with the consistency of wet cement. And all of this would be happening in the aftermath of a magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami that had already devastated the Pacific coast, severed supply lines, overwhelmed hospitals, and consumed the entirety of Japan's emergency response capacity. The compound scenario is not speculative. Each individual element has occurred. They occurred together once, and once is enough to establish that the physics allows it. And this is where the investigation's two threads converge, because the compound threat from the Nankai Trough is not only earthquake, tsunami, and the shadow of volcanic triggering. It is those things happening directly beneath and adjacent to some of the most economically critical, most densely populated, most globally interconnected infrastructure on Earth. And the economic projections for what that intersection produces are numbers that stop being national and start being planetary. Part 9, Hamauka, the supply chain, and the $13 trillion question. There is a nuclear power plant sitting directly above the Nankai Trough. I want to be precise about the geography because the geography is the argument. The Hamauka nuclear power plant, operated by Chubu Electric Power Company, is located in Omaezaki, Shizuoka Prefecture. It sits on a headland that juts into the Pacific Ocean roughly 200 kilometers southwest of central Tokyo. The Nankai megathrust, the plate boundary where the Philippine Sea Plate dives beneath Japan, runs directly beneath the site, not near it, not in the region. Beneath it, the plant's 5 reactor buildings stand on ground that will experience direct megathrust shaking in any Nankai rupture scenario involving the Tokai segment. Hamauka has been offline since 2011. In the weeks following the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, then Prime Minister Naoto Kan asked Chubu Electric to suspend operations, and the reactors have not restarted since. But the spent nuclear fuel remains on site. The cooling systems that prevent that fuel from overheating still require continuous electrical power. And in January 2026, Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority, the NRA, the post-Fukushima regulatory body, created specifically to prevent another nuclear disaster, halted Chubu Electric's reactor safety screening after a whistleblower came forward reporting that seismic data used in the safety evaluation had been fabricated. Specifically, the allegation was that ground motion estimates had been understated, that the data presented to regulators made the earthquake risk look smaller than it actually is. I want to flag this story as developing and its specifics as not yet fully verified, while noting that the NRA's decision to halt the screening process is confirmed by multiple outlets and is a matter of public regulatory record. But Hamauka is one facility on one headland. The stakes become something else entirely when you pull the lens back. The Nankai Trough hazard zone encompasses the Taiheiyo Belt, Japan's Pacific Industrial Corridor. This is the manufacturing backbone of the world's 4th largest economy. A single shelf stacked with the most expensive, most interconnected, most globally consequential industrial inventory on Earth. Nagoya sits in this corridor. Nagoya is the center of Japan's automotive industry. Toyota's global headquarters is in Toyota City, Aichi Prefecture, less than 100 kilometers northwest of the Itsumi Peninsula, where one of the 3 active slow slip events has been quietly running since 2022. The automotive supply chain radiating from this region feeds assembly plants on every inhabited continent. Osaka sits in this corridor, Japan's 2nd largest metropolitan economy, nearly 9 million people in the urban area, a hub for pharmaceuticals, electronics, and financial services, with significant portions of the central city, including the Umeda and Nambo commercial districts, built on soft alluvial sediment deposited by the Yodo and Yamato river systems at or below sea level. In a major earthquake, those areas face a dual threat: intense amplified shaking from the basin effect, followed by potential tsunami inundation through the same river channels and harbor approaches that make the city a commercial center. And Osaka's geology makes it uniquely vulnerable to long-duration shaking. When seismic waves from a distant megathrust enter a soft sediment basin, they don't just pass through. They amplify. The basin acts like a bowl of gelatin sitting on a shaking table. The gelatin wobbles at frequencies and amplitudes that far exceed the input motion. Buildings designed for bedrock conditions experience forces they were never engineered to survive. The duration of strong shaking in a basin during a megathrust event can stretch to 3, 4, 5 minutes, giving far longer than the 15 to 30 seconds of a typical crustal earthquake. Osaka's combination of soft ground, below sea level elevation, and basin amplification makes a Nankai megathrust a qualitatively different threat for this city than for cities built on rock. On March 31st, 2025, The Cabinet Office's Nankai Trough Megaquake Countermeasures Working Group, chaired by Nobuo Fukuwa, professor emeritus at Nagoya University, published its revised worst-case projections. The numbers are enormous, and I want to lay them out without rushing, because the scale collapses into abstraction if you move too fast. Up to 298,000 dead. That figure is actually down from 323,000 in the 2012 assessment. The improvement reflecting a decade of investment in seawalls, early warning systems, building retrofits, and evacuation infrastructure. Of those projected deaths, roughly 215,000 would result from tsunami inundation, not ground shaking. 12.3 million people evacuated, approximately 10% of Japan's entire population, displaced from their homes within 1 week of the event. 2.35 million buildings damaged or destroyed. Shaking at Shindo intensity 7 As, the maximum on Japan's seismic intensity scale, the level at which it becomes nearly impossible to stand, and unreinforced structures collapse across 149 municipalities in 10 prefectures. The estimated flood zone is 30% larger than prior models projected. Direct economic damage, 292.2 trillion yen, up from 237.2 trillion in the earlier estimate, the increase driven primarily by rising construction costs and property values, roughly $2 trillion. A separate Cabinet Office projection estimates GDP would contract by 8.3%, so 45.4 trillion yen outwards in the year following the event. That alone would represent the sharpest single-year economic contraction in any advanced economy since the Second World War. But on June 11, 2025, a different number landed. The Japan Society of Civil Engineers published a long-term assessment through a subcommittee headed by Satoshi Fuji that went far beyond direct damage. Their projection for total economic impact over a 22-year recovery period, 1,466 trillion yen, approximately $13 trillion, 225 trillion in asset destruction, 1,241 trillion in cumulative long-term economic stagnation. The compounding drag of lost manufacturing capacity, severed supply chains, depopulation of devastated regions, collapsed tourism revenue, and the fiscal weight of reconstruction borne by a government already carrying the highest public debt to GDP ratio in the developed world. $13 trillion over 22 years. To put that in a frame you can feel, the total GDP of Germany in 2024 was roughly $4.6 trillion. The JSCE projection says the long-term economic cost of a Nankai megathrust would exceed the annual output of the world's third largest economy, nearly 3 times over. And this isn't abstract modeling. Supply chains running through the Taiheiyo Belt feed semiconductor fabrication, precision machinery, automotive assembly, chemical processing, and advanced materials production that undergird manufacturing on every continent. The 2021 Suez Canal blockage, a single container ship stuck sideways for 6 days, cost global trade an estimated $9.6 billion. That was one shipping lane, 1 week. A Nankai megathrust would shut down industrial output across central Japan for months to years, simultaneously disrupting the port infrastructure that moves the goods, the rail networks that connect the factories, and the workforce that operates both. And every one of these projections, the deaths, the evacuees, the trillions, rests on a single physical variable that the models project, but the infrastructure cannot always survive. The wave, its height, its speed, and the gap between what Japan built after 2011 and what a Nankai worst case actually delivers to the coastline. The arrival times are the part of this story that sat with me longest, because in some of the coastal towns closest to the trough, the first wave capable of killing people arrives in 2 minutes, and 2 minutes is not a warning window. It is a verdict on where you happen to be standing when the fault broke. Part 10, 34 meters in 2 minutes. The worst-case tsunami projection for the Nankai Trough is 34 meters. 34.4, to be precise, the modeled maximum run-up at Kuroshio Town and Tosashimizu City in Kochi Prefecture on the southern coast of Shikoku, facing the open Pacific. That is the height of an 11-story building. To stand at the base of a structure that tall and imagine water filling the space to the top, not a gentle rise, but a pressurized surge moving at highway speeds, carrying debris, automobiles, shattered wood, and concrete too, is to understand that this is not a flood. This is a demolition event delivered by the ocean. But the height is not the number that broke through my detachment as a researcher. The number that did that is the arrival time. In Shizuoka City, a prefectural capital of over 700,000 people, and in Kushimoto, a coastal town at the southern tip of the Kii Peninsula in Wakayama Prefecture, a tsunami of 1 meter or more could arrive in as little as 2 minutes after the earthquake begins. 2 minutes, from the first jolt of shaking to the first surge of water, capable of sweeping a person off their feet. There are 120 seconds. Consider what has to happen in those 2 minutes. The earthquake has to be detected. The Japan Meteorological Agency's automated systems, seismometers, ocean bottom pressure gauges, the entire DONET and NNet network have to confirm the event's location, depth, and magnitude. The system has to calculate tsunami risk. J-Alert, Japan's nationwide instant warning system, has to broadcast the alert simultaneously to mobile phones, television, and radio stations, municipal loudspeakers mounted on poles in every coastal neighborhood, and dedicated receivers in schools, hospitals, and government buildings. That entire chain, detection, calculation, broadcast, takes roughly 3 minutes under optimal conditions for a nearby megathrust event. 3 minutes for the warning. 2 minutes until the water arrives. The math doesn't work. The wave reaches the closest towns before the system can finish telling them it's coming. For an elderly resident on the ground floor of a coastal home in Kushimoto, for a parent with 2 young children in a seaside neighborhood in Shizuoka, for someone in a wheelchair in a single-story building 200 meters from shore, 2 minutes is not a window. 2 minutes is a verdict on where you happen to be standing when the fault broke. Kuroshio Town knows this. The town's emergency planning documents, which are public and which any viewer can access through the Kochi Prefectural Government website, show a tsunami hazard map with run-up flooding reaching 34 meters within 8 minutes of the rupture for an at-risk population of roughly 4,600 people. Their response isn't a seawall. It's a tower, a 22-meter tsunami evacuation tower, one of several vertical evacuation structures positioned within running distance of the densest residential areas. The town's strategy is called zero casualties, and it is built on education, not engineering. Regular drills, marked evacuation routes, the assumption that people will move fast enough to a structure tall enough in the time available, the assumption that 2 minutes or 8 minutes, depending on where you stand, is enough. And the seawalls? After 2011, Japan invested over $12 billion in coastal defenses along the Pacific coast and the Sanriku region in the northeast. Roughly 400 kilometers of reinforced concrete barriers, what the international press called the Great Wall of Japan. The investment was enormous. The engineering was sophisticated. Every meter of wall was designed to a specific height based on modeled tsunami scenarios for each section of coastline. And the 2011 Tohoku disaster had already demonstrated, in the most visceral possible terms, the limit of the concept. The town of Taro in Iwate Prefecture had built its identity around its seawall, 10 meters tall, double-walled in places, one of the tallest coastal defenses in Japan, a structure the town had invested decades in constructing after the 1933 Showa Sanriku tsunami killed more than 900 of its residents. The wall was Taro's answer to the sea. It was featured in textbooks. It was a source of civic pride. On March 11th, 2011, the tsunami overtopped it. 15-meter waves breached and in places physically dismantled the wall. 181 of Taro's residents died. The structure that was supposed to guarantee their safety became, in the time it takes to speak a sentence, irrelevant. The Nankai worst-case project's 34 meters. Typical post-2011 seawall heights along the Pacific coast range from 5 to 15 meters, varying by location and modeled risk. The gap between design capacity and the modeled maximum is not a margin of error. It is a category mismatch, the difference between an umbrella and a river, which is precisely why Kuroshio's strategy bypasses walls entirely and relies on vertical evacuation, towers, hilltops, reinforced upper floors of designated buildings. The wall cannot stop this wave. The question is whether the towers are tall enough, close enough, and accessible enough for the population that needs them in the time that physics allows. And this is where the human dimension of the data becomes inescapable. 215,000 of the projected 298,000 deaths come from tsunami inundation, not from shaking. Ground shaking kills through building collapse, and Japan's building codes, the most earthquake-resistant in the world, have dramatically reduced that number over decades. But the tsunami kills through water, and water doesn't care about building codes. Inundation depends on two variables: wave height and the time people have to move to safety. Japan cannot reduce the wave height. The geometry of the fault and the seafloor determines that. What Japan has tried to do, with towers and drills and J-alert and education campaigns, is expand the time. Push it from seconds toward minutes. Turn 2 minutes into 5. Turn 5 into 8. Every additional minute in the towns closest to the trough is measured in lives. But even the best warning system, the tallest tower, the fastest alert, none of it helps if the planning assumptions themselves are wrong. If the modeled maximum tsunami height is 34 meters and a full trough rupture produces something larger, as Tohoku produced waves that exceeded every model, then the towers built to 34 meters are insufficient by the same margin that Taro's 10-meter wall was insufficient against 15-meter waves. The planning is only as good as the models, and the models are only as good as the data feeding them, which brings the investigation to a part of the Nankai historical record that most coverage skips oversee, because it involves not what the fault has done, but what was done to the record of what the fault did. The two most recent Nankai earthquakes happened during circumstances that guaranteed the data would be distorted, and the distortion is still in the models. Part 11, the wartime earthquake. Japan tried to hide. December 7th, 1944, the same calendar date as the attack on Pearl Harbor, 3 years later. The Tonankai earthquake ruptured the central segments of the Nankai megathrust, magnitude 7.9 to 8.1. The shaking was heaviest across the Nagoya Industrial Corridor, aircraft factories, munitions plants, precision manufacturing facilities that were, at that moment, critical infrastructure for Japan's wartime economy. Over 1,200 people died. Entire neighborhoods in the Nagoya region were flattened. A tsunami struck the Pacific coast, and the Japanese military suppressed the story. Japan, in December 1944, was losing the war, but had not admitted it publicly. The military government maintained absolute information control. Censorship covered every domain of public life: newspapers, radio, scientific publications. News of a devastating earthquake destroying war-critical industrial capacity in Nagoya, the kind of intelligence that could shape an enemy's strategic targeting priorities, was treated as a military secret. Reporting was restricted or prohibited outright. The full scope of the damage was not disclosed to the Japanese public, let alone to international observers. The death toll was not officially confirmed until years after the war ended. Seismological data that would normally have been shared with the global scientific community through established international networks was withheld. Scientists who studied the event were constrained in what they could publish and where. The 1944 Tonankai earthquake happened, and then institutional silence closed over it like water over a stone. 2 years later, December 21st, 1946, Japan, now defeated, occupied by Allied forces, and in the early chaos of post-war reconstruction, the Nankai segment ruptured. Magnitude 8.0 to 8.3. The shaking devastated communities along the coast of Shikoku and the Kii Peninsula that were already struggling to rebuild from wartime damage. Tsunami waves swept ashore. The human toll added to a population already reeling from firebombing, atomic attacks, military casualties, and economic collapse. But this time, the problem wasn't censorship, it was capacity. Japan's instrumental seismic network was in shambles. Stations had been damaged by bombing raids, by the 1944 earthquake itself, by years of deferred maintenance during the final desperate phase of the war. Recording instruments that had not been calibrated or repaired since 1942 were producing data with unknown error margins. The 1946 event was documented. Researchers knew it happened. They estimated the magnitude. They recorded the tsunami, but with gaps in spatial coverage, with instruments running degraded, with a scientific infrastructure operating at a fraction of its pre-war standard. And this matters, not as a footnote of wartime history, but as a direct and ongoing input to the probability models that drive current Nankai planning. Every probability estimate for the Nankai Trough is calibrated against the historical record. The recurrence interval, how often, the fault ruptures, how large the events tend to be, how they cluster and sequence, is derived from the available data points. And the two most recent data points in that record, the events that carry the most statistical weight in any time series analysis, because they are closest to the present, were documented through the dual distortions of military censorship and post-war institutional collapse. The implications for the models are specific and troubling. The 1944 event may have been larger than the reported magnitude of 7.9 to 8.1 suggests. The damage pattern, concentrated in the Nagoya heavy industrial zone, where earthquake destruction was physically indistinguishable from bombing damage in the ruins, makes it difficult to separate seismic effects from wartime effects in the historical reconstructions. Researchers attempting to back-calculate the magnitude from damage reports face an impossible source separation problem. The 1946 event was under-instrumented, recorded by a network that was, in places, running blind. Both events appear in the record as somewhat smaller than the 1707 and 1854 predecessors. But appear is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The true magnitudes may be larger. The true tsunamis may have been higher. The true strain release may have been greater. And if the strain release was greater, the recurrence interval should be longer. The time predictable model, the one that produces the 80% headline, uses strain release to estimate how long it takes for the fault to reload. Underestimate the release, and you underestimate the reload time. Underestimate the reload time, and you overestimate the current probability. The error flows in a specific direction, and it flows toward alarm. Picture a doctor reviewing a patient's medical chart and discovering that the two most recent blood pressure readings were taken under compromised conditions. One measurement by a nurse, instructed by her superiors to minimize the reading, the other with a cuff that hadn't been calibrated in years. Those readings sit in the chart. They shape the treatment plan. They inform the prognosis, but they carry an error that nobody flagged, and every clinical decision built on that chart inherits it. The Nankai probability models inherit the errors of 1944 and 1946, though, and the inheritance is not symmetrical. The time predictable model, the one that produces the 80% number, is especially vulnerable because it depends on precise ground uplift measurements that track how much strain each earthquake released. If the reported magnitudes of the most recent events are biased low, if censorship and instrument degradation produced underestimates, then the model underestimates the strain release from those events. Underestimate the strain release, and you underestimate the time the fault needs to reload. Underestimate the reload time, and you overestimate the current probability. The error flows in a specific, identifiable direction, toward alarm. The BPT model, the one that produced the 20 to 50% alternative in September 2025, is somewhat less sensitive to this particular distortion because it works with recurrence intervals rather than individual uplift measurements. But even the BPT depends on the magnitude estimates being approximately correct because the interval between events carries different statistical weight depending on whether the prior events were magnitude 8.5 or magnitude 8.0. Neither model can correct for data that doesn't exist. No amount of statistical sophistication can resurrect a seismogram that was never recorded, an uplift measurement that was never taken, or a damage survey that was classified by a military censor and lost in the fires that consumed so many Japanese archives in the final year of the war. This investigation has now walked through the current event, the mechanism, the monitoring, the historical pattern, the compound threat, and the stakes. And every time a piece like this goes live, about earthquakes, about any large-scale natural hazard, the same set of claims surfaces in the comments and across social media. They deserve a direct response. Part 12, HARP, Earthquake Weapons, and the Real Human Fingerprint. After every major earthquake, Turkey, Syria in 2023, the Noto Peninsula on New Year's Day, 2024, Vanuatu in 2024, the same claims circulate. HARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Gakona, Alaska. Directed energy weapons, earthquake-triggering technology operated by governments or shadowy organizations. The specific framing varies, but the core claim is consistent. Someone caused this. Someone has the ability to trigger earthquakes, and the public is being kept in the dark. The impulse behind these claims deserves respect, even when the claims themselves don't hold up. When catastrophic events strike with no warning, when the official explanation amounts to plate tectonics, it happens. When institutions that were supposed to protect people failed to predict the failure. It is human and rational to look for agency. Randomness is psychologically intolerable. The idea that a magnitude 9 earthquake can happen beneath a city of millions with zero advance warning, that the leading scientists in the field openly admit they cannot predict it, that the best, the most instrumented nation on earth can offer is a probability estimate it can't even agree on internally. That feels insufficient, and people respond to insufficient explanations by constructing more satisfying ones. Agency fills the void that randomness leaves, but the physics doesn't cooperate. HARP's maximum radiated power is 3.6 megawatts. To put that in a frame you can hold, that's roughly the electrical consumption of a moderately large shopping mall or a couple of city blocks. A magnitude 9 earthquake, which is what the Nankai Trough is capable of producing in a full trough rupture scenario, releases energy equivalent to roughly 480 megatons of TNT. For comparison, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima released approximately 15 kilotons. A magnitude 9 is about 32,000 Hiroshimas. The gap between HARP's output and the energy in a megathrust earthquake is 12 orders of magnitude. That's a 1 followed by 12 zeros. Not a difference in degree, a difference in kind, the distance between a flashlight and the sun. And beyond the energy gap, the mechanism doesn't exist. HARP transmits high-frequency radio waves into the ionosphere, 70 to 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The tectonic faults that generate earthquakes sit 10 to 40 kilometers below the surface. There is no known physical pathway, no coupling mechanism, no energy transfer process, no theoretical framework in any branch of physics A that connects ionospheric radio wave heating to stress changes on a subduction zone. The claim fails on energy. It fails on mechanism. It fails on basic geometry. Directed energy weapons fare no better. The most powerful directed energy systems currently fielded by any militarized high-energy lasers in the 100 kilowatt range produce output roughly 40,000 times weaker than HARP, which is itself 12 orders of magnitude weaker than the target. You might as well claim someone started a forest fire by pointing a laser pointer at it from orbit. The numbers don't merely fail to add up. They don't inhabit the same mathematical universe. But here is where the debunking takes a turn that most people dismissing these claims skip entirely. And this part is worth slowing down for, because it's genuinely interesting. The conspiracy framing latches onto something real. Precursory phenomena, changes in the fault's behavior before a major rupture, are scientifically documented. Kato's 2012 paper in Science showed that slow slip migrated toward the Tohoku hypocenter before the 9.0. Obara and Kato's 2016 paper argues slow earthquakes transfer stress in ways that increase the probability of rupturing the fault areas. The science of precursory activity is legitimate, peer-reviewed, and published in the most prestigious journals in the field. The difference, and it is the entire difference, the one that matters for how you hold this information, is between observing a natural process and controlling it. The conspiracy version says someone knew, someone triggered it, someone is hiding the capability. The scientific version says The fault sometimes signals before it breaks. We can sometimes see the signal in retrospect, and we cannot yet reliably read it in real time, let alone generate it. No laboratory has ever triggered a slow slip event. No experiment has ever induced tectonic tremor. The observation of precursory phenomena is a window into a natural process, not evidence of human control over that process. The distinction matters because collapsing it, treating observation as evidence of control, treating scientists found a pattern as proof that someone caused the earthquake, destroys the public's ability to engage with the actual science. And the actual science, as this investigation has shown, is more alarming, more nuanced, and more interesting than any conspiracy framing. It always is. Geller, Jackson, Kagan, and Mulargia wrote it in Science in 1997, and the statement holds, earthquakes cannot be predicted. What seismology does instead is probabilistic hazard assessment, estimating the likelihood of ground motion levels over decades, which informs building codes, land use planning, insurance pricing, and infrastructure siting decisions. Prediction and hazard assessment are fundamentally different operations. One promises certainty the science cannot deliver. The other provides the best available framework for living with uncertainty. Confusing them serves neither the conspiracy theorists nor the public. And the real human fingerprint on this story, the part that should concern anyone paying attention, is not earthquake triggering. It is the choices human institutions made about what to build, where to build it, how to calculate the risk, and when to share data honestly. Hamaoka Nuclear Power Plant, sited directly above the rupture zone. A decision made before the hazard was fully understood and maintained through decades of institutional inertia. The Moroto Port uplift measurements used as the foundation of the 80% probability despite known and acknowledged reliability problems. A methodological choice that persisted because changing it would mean changing the headline number with all the policy implications that carries. The 1944 censorship, which removed data from the historical record that the models still need. The September 2025 dual probability publication, which quietly acknowledged what critics had been saying for years, but buried the acknowledgement in a technical document that most of the public will never read. These are the real human fingerprints, not the ones the conspiracy theorists imagine, the ones embedded in institutional decisions, in methodological choices, in the slow accretion of convenience over rigor. They are far more consequential than a radio transmitter in Alaska, and the most consequential of all may be the simplest, the assumption, built into every hazard map and every coupling model, that the parts of the fault that creep are the parts that don't break. Because one paper, published in Nature, grounded in both modeling and real-world evidence, says that assumption may be the most dangerous thing in the entire Nankai story. Part 13, the Nota Lapusta problem. When the shock absorber breaks back, in Part 3, the Edgington and Saffer team described the shallow Nankai fault zone as a shock absorber, a section that releases stress harmlessly through slow slip rather than storing it for catastrophic release. That interpretation is reasonable. It is consistent with their data, and there is a peer-reviewed finding that says it might be dangerously incomplete. In 2013, Hiroyuki Noda and Nadia Lapusta at Caltech published a paper in On Nature titled Stable Creeping Fault Segments Can Become Destructive as a Result of Dynamic Weakening. The title alone should give you pause. What they demonstrated through modeling confirmed by observational evidence is that fault segments classified as stably creeping, segments assumed to be safe precisely because they slip slowly and release stress gradually, can, under specific conditions, participate in catastrophic rupture. The mechanism, dynamic weakening. When a fast rupture from an adjacent locked segment propagates into a creeping zone, the rapid loading can overwhelm the creeping segment's ability to absorb the energy. The segment that was supposed to be a barrier becomes part of the rupture surface. The safety valve becomes part of the explosion. And the evidence for this isn't theoretical. It isn't a simulation running on a supercomputer. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake provided the real-world proof. The largest cosismic slip, the displacement that generated the devastating tsunami, the component of the earthquake that killed the most people, occurred in a zone of the Japan Trench that had been classified as stably creeping. Before the earthquake, geodetic coupling maps, the primary tool seismologists use to determine which parts of a fault are dangerous and which are safe, showed this zone as weakly locked or freely slipping. It was colored differently on the hazard maps. It was assessed differently in the risk calculations. It was, by the prevailing scientific consensus, a region where energy was being released gradually, harmlessly, continuously. After the earthquake, that zone had produced 50 meters of slip. 50 meters. More than 160 feet of seafloor displacement in a single event, in a region that the model said would barely participate in a rupture. That displacement shoved a massive column of water upward, generating the tsunami that overwhelmed the Taro seawall, that flooded the Fukushima Daiichi plant, that killed nearly 20,000 people. The safe zone generated the deadliest component of the deadliest natural disaster in modern Japanese history. Nadia Lapusta's assessment of what this means was direct. It requires a re-evaluation of seismic hazard in many areas. Not a tweak. A re-evaluation. Because if creeping zones can rupture catastrophically, then the maps that distinguish locked from creeping, the maps that underpin every hazard assessment for every subduction zone on Earth, are missing a failure mode. Roland Bergman's authoritative 2018 review in Earth and Planetary Science Letters, GEO, The Geophysics, Geology, and Mechanics of Slow Fault Slip, represents the field's own careful self-assessment. Bergman, who has spent decades studying the relationship between slow slip and seismic hazard at UC Berkeley, frames the state of knowledge with a precision that anyone reading the headlines about the Nankai Trough should hear. Understanding slow slip, he wrote, will aid in providing more accurate earthquake hazard characterizations. That sentence is a masterclass in scientific hedging, and the hedging is the point. Future tense, will aid, not has provided, not currently enables, not allows us to predict. The field's leading review openly acknowledges that the promised connection between slow slip observation and actionable hazard assessment remains aspirational. We are watching the fault. We are learning. We are not yet able to translate what we see into a reliable forecast of when, where, or how large the next rupture will be. And Kailin Wang at the Geological Survey of Canada's Pacific Geoscience Centre has been raising a related concern for over 2 decades, one that applies directly to how the current Nankai monitoring data is interpreted. In a 2004 paper in AEOS with Tim Dixon, Wang argued that geodetic coupling maps, the primary tool used to identify which sections of a subduction fault are locked, dangerous, and which are creeping, presumed safe, are routinely overinterpreted. The maps are derived from GPS and other geodetic measurements through a mathematical inversion process. They show where the fault appears to be stuck and where it appears to be slipping. But appears to be and is are different claims when the margin of error in the geodetic inversion is comparable to the magnitude of the signal you're trying to detect. A zone that looks like it's creeping in, the inversion might actually be partially locked. A zone that looks locked might have a measured slow slip occurring at a rate just below the detection threshold. For the Nankai Trough specifically, this means the 3 active slow slip events, Atsumi, Shikoku, Ki, are real and well detected. The instruments see them clearly, but the boundaries between the slipping zones and the adjacent locked zones, the boundaries that determine where slow slip is safely bleeding off, stress versus where the locked zone begins storing it, are less crisp than the maps suggest. The transition zone is uncertain, and in that uncertainty lives the Nota Lapusta problem. So here's the tension at the heart of this investigation, the one that every seismologist working on the Nankai Trough carries with them to work every morning. The Edgington team says the shallow zone is a shock absorber. The Nota Lapusta finding says shock absorbers can fail catastrophically. The monitoring data shows 3 long-term slow slip events active along the trough. Obara and Kato say those events transfer stress to the locked zone, but nobody can say with confidence whether the shallow zone will continue absorbing stress harmlessly, or whether, in the event of a rupture nucleating on an adjacent locked segment, it will be overwhelmed and contribute to the very tsunami it was supposed to prevent, a crack in a dam. Is it relieving pressure safely, preventing the catastrophic failure that would otherwise come, or is it marking the line along which the dam will eventually split open? Same crack, same observation. Two interpretations that lead to opposite conclusions about what to do next. And the cost of choosing the wrong one isn't academic. It's measured in whether 298,000 people live or die. That tension cannot be resolved with the data available today. No paper currently in print, no instrument currently deployed, no model currently running can tell you definitively whether the shallow Nankai slow slip zone will hold as a shock absorber or fail as a rupture surface in the event of a megathrust nucleation on an adjacent locked segment. The science is not there yet. Bergman said it would aid in providing better hazard characterizations. Future tense, aspirational. That aspiration is honest, and honest is the only mode this investigation operates in. So rather than pretending the data supports a single conclusion, the investigation ends where the evidence actually leads, Geruth, with three interpretations, each grounded in specific evidence, each given genuine weight, each carrying a different cost if it turns out to be wrong. Part 14, Interpretation 1, ARC, the reassuring case. Three interpretations, each one grounded in specific evidence, each one carrying a different cost if it turns out to be wrong. The data does not tell us which is correct. What it tells us is what each one requires you to believe, and what each one costs if reality lands somewhere else. The first interpretation is the most reassuring, and presenting it fairly, giving it genuine weight, not building a straw man to knock over, is essential, because this interpretation is not wrong. It is defensible. A serious person could hold it and be making a reasonable assessment of the available evidence. Start with the probability. The headline number, 80% over 30 years, rests on the time-predictable model, which derives from uplift data at Moroto Port that the Earthquake Research Committee itself, in September 2025, called unreliable. When the committee applied the Brownian passage time model, the standard method used for every other fault in Japan, from the Japan Trench to the Itoigawa-Shizuoka line, the number came back at 20 to 50%. That's not a minor adjustment. The lower end of the alternative range is 1/4 of the headline figure. If you walked into a hospital and the doctor said there's an 80% chance you need surgery, and then a second opinion using the standard diagnostic protocol said 20% E, you'd have questions. Legitimate questions. Robert Geller has been asking those questions for decades. Geller's institutional critique runs deeper than methodology. In his 2011 Nature paper, he documented that every Japanese earthquake, causing 10 or more fatalities since 1979, including Kobe in 95 and Tohoku in 2011, struck in zones the official seismic hazard maps rated as low probability. The maps got it wrong. Repeatedly, in the same direction, the zones assessed as most dangerous have not produced the deadliest events. The zones assessed as lower risk have. That track record does not inspire confidence in the precision of the Nankai estimate, regardless of which model generates it. Shinji Yoshioka at Kobe University agrees the 80% figure is likely too high, and he's not a contrarian or a denialist. His position is methodological. The time-predictable model is one approach among several, and it produces a higher number than the alternatives. Choosing to headline the higher number is a policy decision as much as a scientific one. The slow slip evidence cuts both ways under this interpretation. The June 2025 Science paper, the most vivid recent observation, the one this investigation has centered, was interpreted by its own authors as stress relief, not stress loading. Josh Edgington and Demian Saffer described the shallow Nankai fault zone as a shock absorber. Dismissing the interpretation of the researchers who captured the data in favor of a more alarming reading requires a specific justification that the observations themselves do not compel. The shallow zone may be doing exactly what Edgington says it's doing, bleeding off energy harmlessly. Japan's monitoring network is the most comprehensive on Earth. The detection capability for anomalous changes is real and functioning. The built environment is the most earthquake-resistant in the world. Building codes, revised after Tohoku, incorporate lessons learned from the worst modern megathrust disaster, and the 2011 response, despite catastrophic devastation, demonstrated that Japan's emergency systems function under extreme stress. Hospitals operated through the crisis, evacuation routes held, the self-defense forces mobilized within hours. International aid was coordinated efficiently. The country absorbed a magnitude 9 event, and while grievously wounded, maintained social order and institutional continuity. Under this interpretation, the Nankai Trough is a well-monitored, well-understood, well-prepared for hazard, whose probability has been systematically overstated by a model the government itself now acknowledges is problematic. The appropriate response is continued monitoring, sustained preparedness, and calibrated concern, not the alarm that an 80% headline naturally produces. This interpretation is fair. It accounts for the evidence honestly. A careful, informed person could hold it and be making a defensible assessment, but holding it requires specific assumptions. That the Muroto Port critique invalidates the time-predictable model more than it validates the BPT alternative. That shallow, slow slip is genuinely a safety valve, rather than a failure mode in waiting. That the monitoring network's detection capability translates into actionable warning time, and that the Tohoku response provides a valid template for a Nankai event, despite the differences in population density, industrial exposure, and tsunami arrival times. Whether those assumptions hold is what separates this interpretation from the next one. Part 15, Interpretation 2, where the weight of the evidence points. The intermediate interpretation is the one the published scientific literature most directly supports, not the most reassuring reading of the data, not the most alarming. The interpretation that sits closest to the center of gravity of the peer-reviewed evidence as it exists in June 2026. The Nankai Trough is in the late stage of its seismic cycle. That statement is not contested by any credible voice in the field, not by Geller, not by Yoshioka, not by the most conservative researcher in the debate. The last major rupture sequence was 1944 and 1946, 80 years ago. The documented recurrence interval, traced across a millennium of historical records, including the 1707, 1854, and 1944-46 sequences, ranges from roughly 90 to 200 years. Even using the most conservative end of that range, the current moment falls within the window where the next event becomes plausible. And Yoshioka, the same Kobe University researcher who called the 80% figure likely too high, was careful to add a qualifier that changes the weight of his critique entirely. He has no doubt, he said, that a major earthquake will eventually occur along the Nankai Trough. The dispute is about the probability number, not about the physical reality. 3 long-term, slow-slip events are active along the trough right now. Atsumi Peninsula, ongoing since 2022. Central Shikoku, fluctuating since 2019. Southern Kii Peninsula, active since 2020. Detected by over 1,300 GNet stations, confirmed by JMA and HERPI in their official monitoring reports. Obara and Kato's 2016 analysis in Science concluded that slow earthquakes act as stress transfer agents, physically loading adjacent locked segments, increasing the probability of rupturing the fault areas. Kano, Kato, and Obara's 2019 follow-up documented episodic tremor and slip silently invading the locked megathrust. These findings are not speculative claims from fringe researchers seeking attention. They are published in Science, the most rigorously peer-reviewed journal in the field, by the scientists who discovered and named the phenomena they describe. The historical pairing pattern adds a dimension that no statistical model fully captures. On all but one known occasion, eastern segment rupture was followed by western segment rupture within hours to years. The Tokai segment, the easternmost section, closest to the greater Tokyo metropolitan area, has not ruptured since 1854. 172 years of accumulated plate convergence, stored as elastic strain in the locked rock. The pattern does not guarantee sequential rupture in the next event. Patterns in small datasets can mislead. but the consistency across multiple independent rupture sequences spanning 1,000 years, 1854, 1944-46, and the numerous earlier events documented in Japanese historical records and tsunami deposit geology creates a structural expectation that responsible emergency planning cannot dismiss, and the wartime data gap compounds the concern under this interpretation. The two most recent Nankai events, the very events that the probability models weight most heavily, were documented through censorship and institutional collapse. If their magnitudes were understated, the models underestimate the recurrence time and overestimate the current probability. But if the magnitudes were roughly correct and the events were genuinely smaller than their predecessors, that means the fault did not fully release its stored strain in the most recent cycle, leaving a deficit that carries forward into the next event. Under either reading, the data gap is not neutral. It adds uncertainty that pushes in the direction of concern. And Tohoku reshaped the upper bound. Before 2011, the Nankai planning maximum was 8.6. After Tohoku, it was raised to 9.1, an acknowledgement that Japanese hazard models had systematically underestimated maximum magnitudes on subduction zones. The revision was not a refinement of existing knowledge. It was an admission that the models had been wrong about the ceiling. And the correction ran in the direction that increases every downstream projection: tsunami heights, casualty estimates, economic damage. Under this interpretation, the system is loaded. The loading is observable. The historical pattern is clear. The monitoring is excellent, but the prediction capability is absent. A critical distinction. The uncertainty is about timing and magnitude. It is not about whether the event occurs. Imminent is not a word the science supports. Overdue captures the statistical reality within the error bars, even though those error bars span decades. The appropriate response is not alarm. It is sustained, high-level preparedness, pursued with a clear-eyed understanding that both the 80% number and the 20% number are attempts to quantify an uncertainty that may not be reducible with current methods. The fault will rupture. The question is when, how many segments participate, and whether the response capacity matches the specific scenario that materializes are a question that only the event itself will answer. That framing is honest. It captures the published evidence without overclaiming, but it does not address the physical worst case, the scenario that evidence says is possible and the historical record confirms happened. Exactly once. Part 16, Interpretation in 3, the full trough scenario. The third interpretation is not a prediction. No seismologist is predicting this, but it is a physical possibility grounded in documented precedent, and the cost of ignoring it, of treating it as too extreme to plan for, is the lesson Tohoku already taught once. 1707 happened. That is the foundational fact. Every segment of the Nankai Trough ruptured simultaneously. Magnitude 8.6 to 8.7, the largest earthquake in Japanese history until Tohoku 3 centuries later. After 2011 prompted the Central Disaster Prevention Council to raise the hypothetical maximum to 9.1. The full trough scenario entered the official planning framework. A simultaneous rupture at magnitude 9+ is within the physical capability of this fault system. The mechanism has operated before. The only questions are probabilistic, how to weight it against partial rupture scenarios, and probability, as this entire investigation has demonstrated, is the most contested variable in the Nankai story. The Nota Lapusta finding adds a specific, documented mechanism for how a full trough rupture could occur even if segments that are currently creeping are assumed to act as barriers. Fault zones classified as stably creeping, the zones that coupling models color code as safe, can fail catastrophically through dynamic weakening when a fast rupture from a locked segment propagates into them. The energy arrives faster than the creeping zone can absorb it. The barrier becomes part of the rupture. Tohoku demonstrated this in the real world. The zone that produced 50 meters of coseismic slip, the displacement that generated the killing tsunami, had been classified as weakly locked or freely slipping. The safe zone became the most destructive component of the event. If the same mechanism operates on the Nankai Trough, then the shallow shock absorber identified by Edgington and Saffer, may not limit a full trough rupture. It could participate in one. The infrastructure exposure under a full trough scenario has been detailed across this investigation, but concentrating the numbers into a single frame makes the scale land differently. Up to 298,000 dead, the Cabinet Office's revised worst case, and even that assumes current building codes and evacuation infrastructure perform as designed under stresses they have never actually faced. $13 trillion in total economic damage over 22 years. The Japan Society of Civil Engineers projection under Satoshi Fujii, a number so large it ceases to function as a statistic and becomes a description of a different world. A 34-meter tsunami at Kuroshio town, arriving in as little as 2 minutes after the shaking begins. 12.3 million people displaced from their homes within 1 week. 10% of the entire national population, moving inland, needing shelter, food, water, medical care, and functioning institutions to organize the response at a moment when the institutions themselves are located inside the damage zone. The Hamaoka nuclear plant sits directly above the rupture zone with spent fuel on site and a safety review halted by allegations of fabricated seismic data. Osaka, 9 million people, soft sediment below sea level, GI, faces basin-amplified shaking that could persist for 3 to 5 minutes, followed by potential tsunami inundation through the harbor and river channels. The Taiheiyo belt, from Nagoya to Shizuoka, goes dark. Automotive production, semiconductor fabrication, precision machinery, chemical feedstock, for months to years, propagating through global supply chains that have no redundancy at this scale. Imagine you're the emergency manager for Shizuoka Prefecture. The shaking has started. J Alert is broadcasting. Your models say 2 minutes to the first wave on the coast. Your evacuation centers are inland, but the roads between the coast and the centers pass through zones the tsunami models say will flood within 10 minutes. Your hospitals are in the shaking zone. Your communications infrastructure is designed for a 7.0, and this is a 9. You have decisions to make right now, and every one of them was calibrated against a planning scenario that just became obsolete. And the compound dimension. 49 days after 1707, Mount Fuji erupted. The Chesley mechanism, 1.06 bars of normal stress reduction on a magma dike at 20 kilometers depth, is published and quantified. Whether a future rupture would replicate the stress geometry depends on variables that current monitoring cannot resolve. But the pathway exists in the physics, and the pathway operated in the historical record, and a modern version of the Hawaii compound scenario. Earthquake, tsunami, volcanic ashfall reaching Tokyo sits in no integrated operational plan. Under this interpretation, the Nankai Trough represents a system capable of producing a compound catastrophe that exceeds any single hazard planning framework ever constructed. The full trough scenario is the case you plan, for not because it is the most likely outcome, but because the cost of being unprepared, if the physics delivers it, is civilizational. And the markers that would begin to distinguish between these 3 readings of the evidence are specific and identifiable. Part 17, what we know, what we don't, and what would change the assessment. The honest inventory of certainty and uncertainty is, in the end, the most useful thing this investigation can deliver. Not a verdict, not a prediction. A sorted list, what is confirmed, what is uncertain, what is unknown, that you can hold against future developments and measure whether the picture is shifting. What we know. Confirmed, documented, not in serious scientific dispute. The Nankai Trough will rupture again. The Philippine sea plate is subducting beneath Japan at 4 to 6.5 centimeters per year. The convergence has not paused and will not pause. The recurrence pattern, major earthquakes every 90 to 200 years, frequently in pairs, once in a simultaneous full trough event, is traced across a millennium of documentary and geological evidence. The last rupture sequence was 1944 and 1946, 80 years ago. We are within the historical window. Slow slip is active and observable at 3 locations along the trough: Atsumi Peninsula, Central Shikoku, and the Southern Kii Peninsula, confirmed by over 1,300 GeoNet stations and reported in JMA's official monitoring bulletins. The monitoring network is the most comprehensive ever deployed on any fault system in the world, and it is complete, whereas the last gap closed in July 2024 when NNet went operational. The infrastructure exposure is quantified, up to 298,000 deaths, $2 to $13 trillion in economic damage, 12.3 million evacuees, a 34-meter tsunami at the closest coastlines. The post-2011 revised maximum is magnitude 9.1. The pairing pattern is consistent across the historical record. The Hawaii compound volcanic trigger operated through a mechanism that Chesley et al. Have modeled and published. What we don't know, actively debated, uncertain, dependent on observations and analysis that do not yet exist. When the next rupture will occur, nobody knows. Nobody can know with current scientific capabilities. Naoshi Hirata, the HERP chairman and the public face of the 80% probability, said so explicitly in May 2025, the earthquake may come without precursors. The probability itself is contested, 20 to 50% under one model, 60 to 94.5% under another, the difference flowing from a methodological disagreement over a single tide gauge record at a single port. How many segments will participate is unknown. A single segment event, a sequential pair, or a full trough rupture are all physically possible, and the monitoring data cannot distinguish which is more likely for the next occurrence. Whether the currently active slow slip is relieving stress, Edgington's shock absorber interpretation, or intermittently loading the locked zone toward failure, Obara and Cato's stress transfer mechanism, remains genuinely unresolved. Whether the shallow fault zone will act as a barrier in the next rupture or participate through dynamic weakening, the Noda-Lapusta mechanism, is an open scientific question. Whether a full trough event would trigger volcanic activity at Fuji depends on the current state of the magmatic system, which is monitored but not known with the precision needed to evaluate the specific stress threshold. What would change the assessment? 3 specific benchmarks, not gradual trends, but discrete observations that would represent a genuine step change in the threat evaluation. First, JMA elevating the advisory from the current megathrust earthquake caution level to the higher megathrust earthquake warning tier. That elevation is triggered by a magnitude 8.0 or above directly on the Nankai plate boundary within the defined source region. It has never been issued. If it is, the situation has moved from probabilistic concern to active emergency. Second, detection of an anomalous, accelerating long-term, slow slip event in the locked Tokai or Tonankai segments, not in the shallow shock absorber zone that Edgington studied, but in the deeper locked zone where rupture would actually nucleate, at depths of 15 to 30 kilometers. The current 3 SSEs are in the transition zones adjacent to the locked core, a slow slip event migrating into the locked zone itself, or an existing SSE in the transition zone suddenly accelerating beyond its historical baseline, changing from millimeters per year to centimeters per month, would be qualitatively different from what the instruments currently record. It would not be a prediction, but it would narrow the uncertainty in a way that changes the conversation. Third, a magnitude 7+ earthquake positioned closer to the historical rupture edges of the Nankai megathrust than the August 2024 event. That event transferred approximately 0.1 bar of Coulomb stress to the nearest past rupture edge, a small perturbation roughly equivalent to the weight of a 10-centimeter column of water. A larger event, or an event positioned closer to the locked zone, could transfer enough stress to meaningfully shift the probability window, and any earthquake of magnitude 7.5 or above on the Nankai plate boundary itself would, under JMA's framework, trigger evaluation for the higher tier megathrust earthquake warning, a level that has never been reached and whose activation would represent an entirely different category of institutional response. None of these benchmarks has been reached as of June 2026. All 3 are being actively monitored by the most comprehensive fault surveillance system ever built. The instruments are watching for exactly these signals, and if any of them triggers, This investigation will update immediately. The data doesn't give us a clean answer. The data gives us a framework for watching, and specific markers for recognizing when the framework needs to change. Part 18, the close the Nankai Trough, is not going to tell us when. It hasn't told anyone when for 300 years. Not the people of Osaka who climbed onto boats in the harbor in December 1854, who survived the first earthquake and didn't know the second was 32 hours away. Not the factory workers in Nagoya who felt their world shake on a December morning in 1944 and whose earthquake was classified by their own government before the dust had settled. Not the researchers at JMA who watch the GeoNet data refresh every day, who can see the millimeters of slow slip accumulating along the Atsumi Peninsula and the Kii Peninsulas and central Shikoku, and who know that seeing the signal and knowing what it means are not the same thing. Not the residents of Kuroshio town who built a 22-meter tower and rehearse evacuation drills, because the models say the wave arrives in 8 minutes and the tower is the only answer that doesn't depend on a wall that the physics says will fail. The fault operates on its own schedule. Decades, centuries, releasing and storing energy in patterns the instruments can measure, but the science cannot yet fully decode. The probability is contested, 80% or 20% or something in between, depending on which model you trust, which data you believe, and how much weight you give to a tide gauge record at a small harbor in Kochi that's been sinking into the Pacific for 170 years. The debate over that number is real. It is conducted in good faith by serious people, and it will not be resolved by a better model. It will be resolved by the fault. What the instruments tell us right now, today, June 2026, is that the Nankai Trough is moving. Slowly, invisibly, in 3 places simultaneously along a 900-kilometer subduction zone where 80 years of plate convergence sit stored in locked rock beneath the Pacific seabed. The monitoring is real. The hazard is real. The uncertainty is real. And treating the uncertainty as a flaw in the analysis rather than as the most important feature of the evidence is the only way to get this story wrong. This is an ongoing investigation. When the slow slip data shifts, when the long-term deformation signals change character at the Atsumi or Kii or Shikoku stations, when a new earthquake tests the boundaries of the locked zone, when the next paper drops from the borehole observatories or the NNet seafloor sensors or the GNSS acoustic transponders bolted to the deep ocean floor. This channel will cover it. The data does not sleep. The monitoring does not pause, and neither does this work. The Nankai Trough is speaking. Quietly, in a language we are still learning to read. The instruments are listening, and so are we.